Welcome to the MSDW podcast. I'm Jason Gumpert, editor at msdynamicsworld.com, and on this episode, we are catching up with Ramin Marghi of Catapult ERP, who recently wrote about the challenges of on-premises ERP today and why Dynamics 365 Business Central in the public cloud addresses those challenges, if not directly, then through a change of approach that ought to help set organizations on a new course for the future. Of course, the story around Microsoft Business Solutions is not all about ERP anymore, and we also look at why an organization might choose to focus instead on tools like Power Apps and Power Automate, aka Microsoft Flow, or invest in areas like new integrations or better BI. Shopping cart envy? Nomad e-commerce, leader in B2B and B2C e-commerce, can help with their content management, cataloging, and customer service capabilities within a cloud-based web environment. Nomad pulls up-to-date Dynamics data to reflect in your storefront, offering customers a streamlined and easy-to-use online shopping experience. Catalog, cart, customers. Connected. Nomad e-commerce. Hey, Ramin, thanks for joining the podcast today. Welcome.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
I was looking forward to having the opportunity to chat a little more, kind of using your recent article as a basis. You raised some really interesting points talking about why you and your team at Catapult are, urging on-premises not D365, but Dynamics NAV customers to the cloud. And you lay out a pretty interesting list of reasons why it makes sense. Maybe before we just sort of dive into that, can you tell us a little more about who you are, what kind of work you do?
Definitely. I'm by formal training, I'm an accountant. So I'm a bean counter. I'm a designated accountant who kind of shifted, I'd say, kind of focus more or less towards software and consulting. So my background, I started out, the way that most accountants do in AP, working on, oddly enough, a Dynamics GP in environment, and then eventually I shifted over to work with NAV, very very early version of NAV, one of the classic client versions, and I kind of fell in love with the software, and so I really started to tinker, play around with it, building reports, and you really get to appreciate the software when you get deep down into like the table structure and whatnot. And then at some point, Catapult kind of came along, and being a Microsoft partner, I was like, they were keen on finding someone who had domain knowledge, and I was keen on kind of flexing more muscles and more kind of exposure, I'd say, to the product. So then I switched gears and moved to the partner world, and I've been doing it ever since.
All right, so you started with an accounting focus, then kind of gained an appreciation for ERP, and now you're really all about the solution delivery and the solution itself on top of your accounting knowledge.
Yeah, and I still get to work with my fellow bean counters, right? So I still
Sure.
get to work heavily with accountants without having to necessarily do, the accounting side of things.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. All right. Excellent. And I mean, I guess one of the things I'm curious about, sort of what led you to sort of put your thoughts together into this piece about sort of moving from on-premises to cloud. I mean, what are you seeing in your role when you work with your clients that made this sort of the right time to kind of write about that?
Well, to be honest, it's an interesting time. Um, the cloud has always, in some way, shape, or form, been, an option, right? There was always the option of going either private cloud or, one of the earlier iterations of Dynamics 365, Finance Operations Business Edition, for example. But it's never really, I guess, hit that maturity level where there'll be a strong enough argument for it. But Microsoft kind of has really poured tons of resources, and really they've shifted the entire focus of their offering to be cloud first. And it really is something that you can pick up on through the product, through their marketing, through kind of all the different channels in which you might get exposed to Microsoft themselves. It's cloud first, and you can really see it. And so it's not that I'm not trying to sound ominous, but it's an inevitability that you can no longer really avoid. And as opposed to thinking of it in that terms of like, being the writings on the wall, we thought it would be interesting to just talk about why we're excited about it. Because, in the end of the day, we're all, in the software world for a reason. It's not that we're forced to be here. We enjoy software, we appreciate it. So we're equally as excited about the solution as clients would be too. And so we thought that the article, taking on less of a white paper approach of like features and functionality, more so talking about what makes us kind of excited about the future and the current state, and why we are not only just like, you know um, offering it as an option, but we're kind of considering it as the option, the de facto first go to, um, for deploying to the ERP to the cloud, essentially.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense, and you're right. I mean, it's such an interesting perspective on the world when you're, this kind of software, whether it's NAV or something else similar to it, that sort of, I mean, essentially it runs the business world. It all sort of is all the low level details and some of the higher level processes too, but it's all sort of working. It's all sort of working through these systems, and most people don't need to worry about that. But you sort of see it you're sort of seeing business sort of happen through that perspective, which is pretty interesting. And I guess one of the early points that you make, which I absolutely agree with, is um, you know with on-prem systems, it's just easy for them to become stagnant or out of date very very quickly. And I think this is, but I don't know. I mean, my sense is that for a lot of firms, it happens slowly enough that maybe they don't appreciate some of the constraints that it begins to put on them. Was that part of your point about um, what happens to a company over time when they sort of are living with an on-prem ERP that they've deployed and sort of have sitting there.
Exactly. That's totally it. And actually, that terminology, living with, is kind of a great usage in this context, right? Because really, the software it shouldn't be something that you put up with. It should be something that really drives your business in many ways too, right? And and oftentimes, when you deploy an on-prem solution, you're deploying a point in time, kind of, this is what it is, and that's the be all end all of what you've paid for and you've deployed, right? It's not an evolving kind of solution. It doesn't grow with you, essentially, right? And so that kind of fear of missing out, that FOMO, and kind of all the disadvantages of being stuck in solid state, really start to kind of show, even as far as 6 months into an on-prem deployment, right? As soon as clients begin to figure out that the next version of NAV, for example, if we're going with NAV as the example, has this feature and that feature and this feature, and then like, oh well, we wish we would have waited. But it's that constant kind of game of like, the grass is greener on the other side, and like the newer versions, right? We don't have any of that really in the cloud, and I think um, that's a huge plus for clients. They no longer have to think of their ERP as something they put up with, but rather something that they can look forward to evolving with them and exploring, right?
Um, are are are, uh, are your clients or prospects, are they buying this? Because it sounds good, but do you get much resistance?
You'd be surprised. I find it's, and maybe it's the sticker price, but we're finding extremely little resistance,
Mm.
like next to none actually. And I think it may be that the rest of the economy has kind of prepared them for this, because subscriptions aren't something new. They are kind of, terra incognita in the enterprise software kind of side of things, right? Especially ERPs. But everywhere else in kind of the economy, you subscribe to everything, like the whole like Netflix revolution, and even like these the loot crates or whatever, they have those monthly kind of boxes that come in. We've really been conditioned as the general kind of public to be accepting and actually to buy into that concept where you really don't want to just pay a huge amount of money up front and then be stuck with one thing. You want to kind of, where we're being more and more comfortable with paying over time and getting more value, essentially, in the long run, right?
Yeah, this is honestly something that I'm trying to get my head around because I hear what you're saying, and I believe you that there's a lot of organizations out there that are really welcoming of this message. But then I have conversations with other, either consultants or end users, people from end user companies that have GP or NAV, and they're not sold on it, and I'm trying to just not right in the not that I think we'll work it out in
That's
the
right.
next few minutes, but trying to work out exactly what it is that sort of where these people or organizations diverge. I mean, I think there's not one thing, but there's a. I mean, you see it. I see it with AX. I see it with GP. I don't. I see a little bit. I think with the NAV community. Maybe some of the sort of the people who've been in the in the channel for longer amounts of time and maybe have a lot more legacy customers that they support, perhaps, or I don't know, different situations. But I'm this is one of my sort of ongoing investigations or ways of thinking. It's like, what is it that makes some companies open to
Yeah.
open to this and others not? I guess one other area that to me is sort of kind of where they're at this particular point in time. Are they really feeling the pain and constraint of an older system? Or do they? Or another one is like, do they have a leader who is kind of going to going to push and support and nurture the interest in modernizing ERP or not? Those are a couple of the factors that they're sort of in my hypothesis right now.
You bring a good point. It really is leadership for sure on the both the IT and finance side of things, has a huge bearing on how receptive they are to the basically the new paradigm, right? And pain points are another one too. If the pain points aren't really that, if you have a system that works and it works well and all your people have been using it for a long time, and you don't have that FOMO, that fear of missing out, none of the new functionality really appeals to you or isn't really part of your business reality, then yeah, it's definitely a tougher sell. Then I think the onus falls on the partner to really kind of get to ramp up the excitement to talk about, what's new and kind of where to see things. The other thing that I think is also kind of scarier is when it comes to budgeting, right? Because usually when you deploy a monolithic on-prem solution, it's part of your capital budget. It's something you can map out, plan out, and even like the projects when you're working with partners, it's a very specific set of hours, specific set of outcomes, deliverables. It's a very easy to understand. I'm paying this and I'm getting this, and this is what it's going to be indefinitely, right? Whereas with the cloud model, actually not just just generally the subscription kind of lifetime um, value, let's call it, model, it really is, it's more trust as opposed to definitive comfort with like the knowledge of what your product is, because your product today will not be your product a year from now, right? And I think that takes a very different generation, a very different mindset. So you're absolutely right. It does depend on the size of the business. Probably is another one, because risk tolerances are probably a lot lower around in those like really large AX, for example, deployments. But also, yeah, the leadership and how comfortable they are with the being on cutting edge versus being set with something that they know for sure is a defined scope, defined product that does exactly what their business has been using it for, right?
Yeah, yeah. It makes me think of I'm doing an ongoing series of podcast episodes focused on AX upgrades to F&O and the different approaches there. But and not to get into that too far, but one of the things someone said something you just said reminded me, which was that it was a company that was, I think, private equity owned, and their ownership was really focused on. They were fine with a capital expense, but they didn't want to see operating expenses increase.
That's right. Yeah.
And it was, I guess you've heard that before. You understand that better than I do. But that creates a real hurdle for them, really, on the cloud model overall. And I just wonder what I figure that to some extent those views will, at least in some companies, have to start changing in the next few years, because you can only stay on a legacy AX for so long before you're putting your company at such risk, and you're going to either have to move to that cloud model, essentially, because Microsoft's not giving you much option, or
That's
um, which they give you more option with Business Central, I suppose. But you also you could look elsewhere and just look at other places in the market that will be more accommodating with perpetual licenses, right? But so there's all sorts of different reactions, I guess, out there.
It, you know the AX side of things to me is fascinating beyond measure. Like that whole like that whole side of things, I can't in my mind is completely lobotomized from, for example, the NAV GP SL whatever. You know that side of
Mm-hmm.
the Dynamics family to me, like there's a very solid border between AX and everything else. And it's kind of interesting because have you heard of Project Green?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
So so yeah, it's decades ago, Microsoft, they wanted to take all these dynamic stuff and basically merge them into one product, right? That was kind of their vision back then. And it's funny how they kind of came to fruition with Business Central in that sense. I mean, at its core, it is NAV, but really the path forward to the cloud with GP, SL,
Yeah.
all these things is Business Central. So they really have merged them all in that sense. But it's funny how AX is still a defined separate thing. It's not Business Central. It's finance
Yeah.
operations,
Yeah.
right?
The place where it really gets interesting, and again, I go back to some of the people I've talked to on this AX series, is, you know, there's this overlap area, as I'm sure you know, where there's larger companies running NAV, smaller companies running AX. Did they make the right decision? I mean, each one's a separate case, obviously, but there's really sort of this sort of brackish area where some are dedicated to AX, some maybe looking back 10 years if they started 10 years ago or more. I don't know if that was the right decision for them in the long term. And then there's these NAV customers I hear about. Usually names of the companies are not associated, but it's like, thousands of seats of NAV. I mean, I think
Yeah,
it's just incredible what some companies have been willing to do with the product to sort of suit their needs over the years, and it's not going to change anytime soon.
exactly. Yeah.
Um,
It is kind of fascinating. And
yeah.
yeah, I would love to speak to someone at Microsoft who would kind of come up who was part of that discussion in the room when they decided, okay, so NAV is the base then. You know what I mean? Like
Right. Yeah.
that decision alone, I would still love to be a fly on the wall in that in during that meeting, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And this is still an ongoing saga. I mean, you talked about it, that it's not Project Green. It's not sort of a one big push to unify, ERP. Um, but Business Central is the future, and I think we're going to hear more. You might say about efforts to make sure that happens, efforts to make sure it's easier to get to Business Central,
Mm, yeah.
technically, and I bet you'll see promotions and other things to really try to grease the skids, as it were, but it's a multi-year project. My sense is that Microsoft themselves seem to understand that they really need to do everything they can to try to keep these organizations on Azure, on Microsoft's stack of business
That's
solutions,
true. Yeah.
not to see them wander off to NetSuite or Intact or or even some of the bigger ones, Acumatica or whatever. So
Yeah,
anyway,
like yeah,
uh, you know,
it's I think in the next, I don't know, let's say if you use Microsoft Office, I think in the next 5 to 10 years, it'll be virtually impossible to make the case to leave the Microsoft ecosystem.
hmm,
Like just the whole common data model, it's convoluted and it's kind of weird, and Business Central itself does not really, buy into the common data model yet. I mean, there's inklings of it, but it's not the full blown, kind of that common shared data paradigm yet, fully deployed in there. But eventually, and that they're you can see it that they're slowly but surely kind of shifting towards that, where it'll actually be a lot more effort to move away from a product that is on the Microsoft stack than to kind of stick around and work with it,
yeah, for sure. I have to say, I was just at Ignite this week, and at the time that we're recording this, that'll be a little bit older news by the time this comes out. But I saw sort of the latest demo of dual right CDS between finance and operations and sales apps. So not Business Central
Yeah.
yet, like you were saying, it's still lagging, but the dual right seems better. than it has been, and I think they're going to keep pushing out progress on it. So I mean, they were demoing, at least really quick, sort of really quick dual write, seeing it, creating data in one system, being able to work with it, even validate against it in the other system quickly. So I mean, they were limited
Nice.
examples, but it certainly seemed like progress to me, and I think I posted something about it in an article just today because I thought it was interesting. But yeah, I mean that's the big question is how. Well, the other thing I would just add, it was Mike Ehrenberg who was demoing it, and if anyone is sort of aware of where Business Central needs to go, it's him,
Yeah.
obviously. So he's I think as aware or as sort of involved in that as anybody.
Nice. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's funny that you mentioned it's not in Business Central yet. It's kind of lagging. Business Central has gotten a lot of flack, I would say, from some of the hardcore nav people, like the community, essentially the client base anyway, and even partners to some extent, around why it's taking so long to get parity for certain interface elements, kind of, just interface element, like even just
Like from
saving
Nav,
filters.
between Nav and
Yeah,
Business Central.
compared to nav. But it's funny though, because I kind of take it the other way around. I would much prefer them to kind of take a step back and think about what makes sense in the cloud. And so maybe we'll have to wait a year or like 6 months or whatever, right, until we get the feature in its beginning forms anyway. But I'm sure, like, I would much rather a well thought out platform than a rushed kind of copy paste of code, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of the great thing about Microsoft is they have so much experience in the cloud just from CRM, which is their own kind of baked from scratch kind of product, right? That I think, there's that institutional knowledge and that experience that really dovetails and feeds into the Business Central kind of experience and interface. And I think we're going to see more of leveraging of that kind of knowledge over into the Business Central side. It'll just take longer, but at least it'll be more methodical, more thought out, right?
Yeah, I think it just does require some patience, and I think the line has been, if they get this right in F&O, they can, in theory, move, you reuse some of the same logic and at least what they've learned about that to bring it over to Business Central when they think
Exactly.
it's ready.
Yeah.
Another thought I've been having, I'd be interested to get your thought on it too, because it does relate to some of the some of the areas where there might be resistance or reasons that you'd be debating whether or not to move to the cloud with Business Central, is just this idea of, maybe I'm happy with, or not happy with, but maybe, upgrading or migrating my nav solution is just not happening right now for whatever reason. But look at all these, look at all these other kind of cool things I'm seeing in in the Microsoft ecosystem tied to let's say my Office 365 solution. Things like Power Platform, like you mentioned, CDS, reporting, Azure technology, like some of the data warehouse stuff that's coming out. There was this Synapse announcement, which was pretty cool.
And
Um,
Azure Arc. Azure
yeah,
Arc is the
Arc.
one.
Yeah, yeah. So all this other stuff. API management, which I think is maybe more sort of for big IT organizations than small businesses, um, but I don't know. Anyway, with all these different potential interesting and cool ideas, do you ever hear like, why don't we just leave Nav where it is, and let's start building around it and automating around it? And just like worry about ERP later. Does that ever come up?
Yes, it does. Especially I find this kind of interesting, especially with the clients who've just recently, well, and when I say recent, I mean within the past 2 years, right, have done like a major upgrade to, let's say, now 2017, 2018. It's a bigger sell to get someone who just went 2017, 2018 to
Yeah.
even think about redeploying ERP, no matter what the cost is. We could even say it's like, it's completely free, but I don't think the undertaking is something that they would go through. But yeah, we do get that. And so we still are supporting our on-prem solution and solution clients, and we are deploying things like Power BI for them, and all that kind of stuff too. And some of them are there's some clients we have, they're like, no, we have ERP, we just want to use you guys for your CRM services, and we're more than happy to do that, right? It does come around a lot. Like I would say a good chunk of our clients who were like in the past 2 or 3 years had done upgrades are not thinking about Business
Yeah.
Central right now. But it's interesting because it's not that they're still keeping an eye on it, which I find fascinating. Because I remember even in on-prem, like back in, let's say, the NAV 2015, 2016 kind of realm, back then, even 2013 R2, the clients would never even ask us about what's new in 2016, what's new in 2015. You know what I mean? Like when it comes to on-prem, it's less of an incentive to even think about what's in the next on-prem version.
Right.
Whereas now, like it's weird, we're getting pokes and prods, and like people are seeing buttons in nav, like they see the button for flow and they want to talk about it, they want to explore it, they just want to know what it is, right? Or even like they see the Power BI kind of thing on their role center, and they want to know how to work with that. So then we have to go through, the Azure portal and get the whole app registration and kind of get them going on Power BI. And so we do see that. We do see, like you said, some clients who are like they don't want to talk about their ERP upgrade yet, but they do want to explore the Power Platform, for example. Power Platform is probably the most common ask at this point. But yeah.
That makes sense. Just something else interesting. Someone told me recently was just the notion of, um, if you're not ready to touch ERP, at least like there's value in investing in, say, building out integrations now, just so you go through even if it's just for the exercise, so that you've mapped out what the data is, how it flows, what the business rules are. I mean, if you can sit with that before you plan an upgrade, you've already sort of done some of the you know the hardest work, or the work that could
Yes.
be problematic later. I imagine similar with like data warehouse. If you decide that was of value, doing that without changing your ERP is still really valuable, to work
Yeah.
out a model that works for your organization and your IT.
To be honest, actually, that's a very interesting point about data warehousing too. Depending on how much data you actually work with, the cloud may not even be an option for you,
Hmm.
right? It's there was this one odd situation in the past year. Well, not year, I'd say at this point it's like 6 months or so, where a client, and sorry to throw, but they had a jet report, right? And it
Sure.
was a very convoluted one, and we even went to Jet to kind of try to we did our own optimization. We cut down the refresh time, but we also went to Jet to get it cut down further, and it wouldn't cut down. It was such a complex report that required so much um, you know data basically and calculation, and it wasn't something that they want to just run overnight to see the results. It was one that they wanted to run multiple times a day. Effectively, they self disqualified out of the cloud-based solution. Like no matter how much rationalization we tried to do, is like, can you meet at this need? What about Power BI? We tried different things. Nothing really fit for their management team that they were comfortable with. So there are, oddly enough, some weird things, and so that's one of those things that you'd only know if you go down the path of actually exploring and
Yeah.
understanding your data needs, right?
Yeah. So they needed to be able to pull the latest data multiple times a day, and uh, like as I understand data warehousing, I'm definitely not an expert in it, but like the data is not always that fresh,
That's right.
and
Yeah.
so uh, the effort to do all those sort of data warehouse types of things wasn't going to make sense for their needs and the scope of their needs.
Yeah, and so it doesn't happen often
Mm-hmm.
because, accountants, as much as we are big fans of data, we're never super real-time data people. A lot of people say accountants are stuck in the past, right? Because everything is historical cost, everything is like prior year analysis or whatever. But in this particular situation, there was a lot of sensitivity and like really tight timelines that involve multiple stakeholders, auditors, and all this kind of jazz across multiple companies, all sorts of dimensionalization. It was a dog's breakfast. So I mean, and it very may well it may very well be that they need to kind of take a step back and rethink what the end game here is and try to map how that would work in a cloud environment. But OData just wasn't cutting it. So anyway, yeah, that's kind of one of those things. But to your point, actually, another thing that I would say is even if you're sticking to on-prem, another thing, and oddly enough, coincidentally, Chloe knows this. I'm writing a blog post about it tomorrow. Is about rethinking your customizations. So I am of the opinion that even if you're not planning to go to cloud this year, next year, the year after, if you're on a version that supports extensions, it's beneficial to go through and try to kind of retire the old cal code
Mm-hmm.
extensions and convert them to extensions, you
Yeah,
know?
great point.
And
And
it's
that's
because
you have to be up to what to be able to write extensions? 2018.
I mean, technically there's the V1, right, in 2017. But yeah, the 2018 would probably be the strongest candidate.
Mm,
Like I think if 2018, if you're on 2018, you should be going through this exercise. If you're anything prior, you should probably be keeping tabs on what your customizations are and trying to rationalize what they're doing and why. And so that, when it comes to cloud, you can either compare that to new base functionality, say, will this need be met, through core functionality? Or if not, is it something that can be extensionalized, let's call it?
right.
um, or is it something you even need, right? Like, can we re-engineer your process to meet that need? So there's a ton of value. It's just, they say like the first step is knowing that you have a problem. So I think it's that same concept applies with customizations. Like we there was, and this, nav, the whole nav kind of ecosystem, maybe a decade or so, or maybe even more ago, there was a very strong culture to customize, right? We were heavily in that culture, and it eventually caught up to us, and now people want to keep it base. But this is one of those things that we have to, I think every client should go through to think about their customizations.
Right. Yeah. I mean, if you want to really kind of crack open a whole other topic area that's related to that someone else put to me, and again, I'm still trying to get my head around, but the idea that when it comes to extensions and it comes to Power Apps, it's like there. I don't know what you can tell me what you think of this. That they're almost like competing, sort of competing models for the future of, custom application development in the Microsoft ecosystem to some extent, and how well Business Central is going to play with Power Platform versus sort of support its own extension model is maybe one of the real long-term roadmap questions that Microsoft's going to have to grapple with.
Absolutely. And it goes beyond just Power Apps, right? So sometimes you do something in Nav where if you or sorry, let's say Business Central in this case, if you legitimately look at it, would maybe makes more sense on a platform as opposed to software, right? Maybe makes more sense as like part of CRM, right? As like a custom entity with a whole bunch of like workflows and whatever in CRM.
Mm-hmm.
So, and like, but to your point, um, yes, there's that kind of that insight where potentially you could do something, whether in Business Central using AL extensions, or possibly on a Power App, or possibly kind of on CRM, or possibly like
Yeah.
then you have to kind of start thinking in like four dimensions and trying to figure out what makes the most sense, who needs to own the data, and like all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, look. I mean, I would never, at least at this point, I would definitely not say there's one answer. It doesn't seem like there is, but yeah, there's so much to consider there. I think it's another reason why, in addition to some of those suggestions that you made there about moving to extensions and thinking about your reporting needs and all that, just understanding sort of where Microsoft is at with this, even if you think you're a few years out. That as your vendor, I think you need to understand where they're going because I think they're carving out a fairly coherent,
Story, right? Like,
story. I would
yeah.
say, but it's not necessarily a story that's written just for the Nav legacy, customers or the GP customers certainly, or even AX customers. I mean, it's something that if you're a few years out, you're going to have to sort of reach some of your own conclusions about what it means for you.
The other thing I will say is also Microsoft doesn't make it very easy either. I mean, sorry, they make it easy to build the apps or whatever, but I find that a lot of their demos that they put, they're beautiful, polished demos that showcase like really cool uses of Power Apps and Power BI, but they're always a little bit huge, right? It's always like some organization that's managing, let's say, 200 trucks and a fleet management system that needs real-time kind of IoT sensors on like a dishwasher or whatever. You know what I mean? Like there's always
Mm-hmm.
a use case scenario that goes just one step too far for the middle, the mid-size kind of market, right? So watching those videos is always fascinating from a partner perspective. But then in the back of my head, I'm like, okay, well, how can I take that same concept and kind of really pare it down, water it down for like my, like, I don't know, my 10 license, client, for example, right? Like how can they
Yeah.
use it in their kind of smaller scale business? I'd like to see a lot more examples of like just generally like everyday companies. Like they had some pretty good examples using things like vacation trackers, which I think is, or vacation requests and approval and tracking. Those templates are awesome. That's something
Mm-hmm.
that every organization can leverage, right? Now, if they did the same thing for like expense claim submission, then suddenly you have a compelling argument to move, to actually deploy that across virtually everyone who uses AP and has like expense claims, right? So that's one kind of thing I would like to see more of, and we may see more of once, again, the common data CDS, like you're saying, is more ubiquitous or integrated, let's say, into Business Central.
Yeah, and I would just add that I think if you and the Catapult team come up with good examples, I mean, I think that's gold for any partner to have those in their back pocket. And I think Microsoft is looking for them, honestly, as much as they are developing them themselves. Because I think the people developing demos are pre-sales people who are coming up with ways to show off the product,
Yeah,
and people like you in the out in the field working with real customers will come up with something completely imagined from a completely different perspective. And yeah, so um, I'm interested to see kind of where things come from demo wise on both sides.
mm,
From my
it's a
from
good
my
point.
easy perspective, because I don't have to come up with any of them.
That's a fair point. I'm putting a lot on Microsoft when
Yeah.
realistically I could. Yeah, that's true. It probably does fall more to partners to come up with those ideas and.
Yeah. From what I've heard, I mean, not that I see it a lot, but I'll hear from people from time to time who are in the partner channel that when they come up with a really great demo of the latest Microsoft technology, it really pays off for them. I'm sure you've seen that too. I mean, it's probably no
Yes, for
surprise.
sure.
Um,
Yeah.
all right, so where are we here? Yeah, so I mean, it sounds like from your side, it's a pretty coherent viewpoint that you're bringing to your customers, just to sort of wrap things up. Um, if they're thinking about an investment in ERP, or certainly a change from a legacy system like NAV, it's gonna you're going to be talking to them, and Catapult are going to be talking to them about moving to the cloud, and what you know about that at this point. And I would say at this point you must have quite you know b- quite a number of customers who have done it. You've been through it. Your team's been through it quite a few times at this point, so you have some perspective when you're talking about it.
That's right. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, a lot of the stuff we've been seeing is net new, right? A lot of them have been like, we're looking, or actually have either selected or did like this formal RFP kind of thing. But
Oh,
even
okay.
from within the existing NAV client base, we have at least like a handful in the past year or 7 months, I guess, of this year, that have gone through the effort of moving to Business Central.
Mm-hmm.
Interestingly enough, though, an anecdotal note, a lot of those were 2013 or prior. Oh, no, sorry, are 2013 R2 or prior.
Or
My
prior, yeah.
mistake.
Well, I guess that
Yeah.
sort of makes sense, like you said earlier. I mean, just thinking myself, I think that the older the ERP, the more sort of scared people become.
Yeah, it's true.
And I would, yeah, I mean, I didn't surprise me when you said, if you're on 2017 or 2018, and 2018 is sort of the last NAV version, right? Or is it 2018 or
That's right. Yeah.
yeah? So I mean, if you're there, you're probably thinking, well, the upgrade tools will work for me. Why disrupt my business or risk anything until I really feel like it? But I would say if you're on 2013 or 2009, right? That's before 2013. Am I skipping a version or two? But
2009 R2, but 2009 R2 is no one talks about. Let's never talk about
really,
R2.
there.
Well, R2 was the funny one, the in between one where it had both classic and the roll tailor client.
Oh, okay, right.
It's that odd kind of Franken nav. But
Yeah.
but yeah, no, you're right though. If you're on that kind of prior version where even dimensions work differently, you're probably better off just re-implementing essentially
Mm-hmm.
into the cloud as opposed to upgrading your data, right?
Interesting. Well, we'll have to check back in sometime down the road. It's been fun chatting with you about this stuff, and I imagine that much like customer perspective, you and your company's perspective will sort of evolve over time too, as you get more projects under your belt and see the product mature and all that too.
Yeah, it's exciting times. It's honestly probably the most exciting time to be a Microsoft partner right now. When there's so much changing, so much to look forward to. And it comes with its frustrations too, but it's also like, I don't know, every day is something new.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, like I mentioned earlier, having just I went through, I've been to a couple events in the last month, and um, I sense mostly, for people who are forward-looking, optimism. I think there's, I mentioned this starting out, there's definitely a whole population that has to still be sold on some of the changes and why they are worth considering or worth investing in. But so there's not everyone's sold yet, but I think the people are open to it, sort of like Microsoft's direction, sort of not, even if you put aside sort of the direct impact on any one company in terms of what particularly might be changing, or particular cost in a particular situation. Those things are always going to be debatable,
Yeah.
but yeah, I sense optimism. I guess I'm sort of agreeing with you.
And it'd be great if in a future session, we could just bring one of our clients on to chat. Like, hey, you were on-prem, you're in the cloud now.
Yeah, no, that's a great idea. We like I was mentioning earlier. I mean, I've learned a lot talking to AX to F&O, upgrade stories, or people who at least considered it, because there's a lot to learn from those who do, and even those I mean, even those who haven't. I've talked to a few of those on the AX side. That's interesting too. I don't know if that's someone that you would think of, but yeah, it's absolutely. Let's try to do that sometime.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
All right. Thanks, Ramin. It's been fun chatting with you here.
Definitely. Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
This has been another episode of the MSDW podcast. My thanks to Ramin Marghi for joining me today. If you have any feedback, please do get in touch. jgumpert at msdynamicsworld.com. Until next time, this is MS Dynamics World, signing off.